Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Well, Canada has jumped way ahead by an incredible amount. There are at least 4 times as many downloads in the Great White North. You folks down under, well, time to start catching up. Tell your friends to listen. The boys in the white lab coats over at CERN fired up their enormous collider and did something last Tuesday. They say this will benefit all of mankind as they're spending millions of dollars. I'm just amazed the United States isn't being bilked for this expenses involved. They were going to build the superconducting super collider in the vicinity of Waxahachie, Texas. A good thing the funding was pulled. Rumor has it they stopped construction when they discovered that nobody could spell the name of the town. Did you know if you're speeding through Waxahachie, the police will wait until you leave the city to pull you over and write you up? That's because the county name is Ellis, and it's easier to spell than Waxahachie. Oh, come on, I'm kidding. Waxahachie is printed at the top of the ticket. At CERN, they're looking for subatomic particles so they can prove the Big Bang actually happened. It's like they're trying to prove God doesn't exist. As some say, the end result of the experiments may open a portal or a gateway between our universe and another one, the next one over maybe. Once this gate is opened, who knows what might come over? I'll bet it won't be very nice. Something out of an H.P. Lovecraft novel. The white-coated folks are willing to risk the entire world to see what they can do. Who put them in charge? I'm still wondering about that it wasn't a real sacrifice they had at the base of the statue of Shiva the Destroyer. The guy who caught the whole thing on video, the one that put it on YouTube, is still missing. He vanished shortly after the video was released, and they still can't find him. November 2020, I did a show on Stargates. Last week, Eric Barrasso sent me a couple of videos about the Stargate, or maybe Stargates, located in the Middle East. This got me to thinking I should revisit the stories of whether or not there are means of travel hidden away in secret locations that only the elite think they should be allowed to use. The boys in the white lab coat just love to tell us aliens from distant planets can't get here because it's too far. They're assuming the aliens have only decided to come to our planet in the last few decades. If it would take thousands of years to get to Earth, maybe the aliens started in our direction thousands of years ago. I have a kitten sneaking onto the desk, and I don't want him to mess with any of the buttons. He'll turn something up, down, or off, and there he is. Cats, you gotta love them or hate them or whatever. They're taking over the world. Maybe they discovered some other means of travel. That's the aliens. A wormhole is a kind of a tunnel that might just take us to another dimension or a distant part of the universe. A wormhole or Einstein-Rosen bridge or Einstein-Rosen wormhole is a speculative structure linking disparate parts in space and time and is based on a special solution of the Einstein field equations. A wormhole can be visualized as a tunnel with two ends at separate points in space-time, at different locations or different points in time. In other words, you may travel in space or you may travel in time. And there he is again. Yes, I put up with these guys all the time. They get up on the desk and they push buttons and they change settings and anyway, that's my life. There's another one sneaking around on the other side of the desk. Wormholes are just theoretical, but a lot of what Einstein theorized became fact. It's kind of bizarre to think how some people are so advanced in their abilities to think, while others have a hard time walking and chewing gum. A Stargate is an alien device designed to make rapid movement from some distant star to another point in the universe, maybe our planet. The idea is some of our alien visitors came from societies thousands, maybe millions of years more advanced than us. They can chew gum and walk and do other things all at once. Read a book. In the Bible, it says God created man. It never says he didn't create other beings. He did say, "Let us create man in our image." Maybe he had already made similar creatures or some other form of being that lived in distant star systems. The angels had been created long before us. Who knows what all kinds of creatures might be running around and for how long? Just go out at night and look up at the sky and look at all of those distant stars and then say to yourself, we're it? This is the only star in the entire universe with beings living near it? Doesn't make much sense. What would a Stargate look like? In the movies, they're usually huge round stone structures with bizarre writing around the edges. Perhaps the folks who built the Stargates made them from whatever kind of materials they found at the location. Stone is plentiful here and it lasts a long time, as in forever. Just look at the pyramids. Stone is a lousy conductor of energy. This could be necessary for the transportation to take place, like a huge insulator. You don't want the gate to go along with whoever or whatever is being sent to the other location. Hollywood has made a lot of movies and TV shows dealing with Stargates. Some say the folks out in California are being used to saturate people's minds with things such as UFOs and Men in Black and other things that the government want us to ignore or consider just something we saw on TV. How many times has someone seen something unexplainable only to be accused of getting the images from too much TV? Kids who tell their parents they saw a ghost are usually told they can't watch any more scary movies. They saw a ghost because they watch TV, not because the house is haunted. The power to run a Stargate has to come from somewhere. The locations where these things have been found usually are well away from energy sources, at least the power plants that we know of. Ley lines are found all over the planet, and just about every ancient holy place is found along one or many of these lines. Stargates might draw their power from the Earth itself. The energy might be coming from the other end. If aliens wanted to control who used the Stargate, they could make them to receive energy from their end and only function when they want to come or go. I'm having to speculate a lot here since the government isn't answering any of my inquiries. I did talk to a Special Forces major one time. He said he never saw or heard of any Stargates. I'm sure he wasn't lying, but I didn't know him all that well. If the government won't tell us the truth about JFK, they sure aren't going to tell us about alien transportation devices. After the Peace Treaty of Versailles, 1919, at the end of World War I, the idea was put forth by the League of Nations to create a mandate for territories that the defeated Central powers had occupied began to take shape. The proposed idea was the territories would be eventually independent. This was to take place only after having been trained or guided by one of the victorious countries. Borders were redrawn by the winners to make Europe and the Middle East more to their liking. We don't like Germany being so big, so we're going to cut it in half and give some of that land to Poland. The first country to find themselves being recreated was Turkey. They had a long history of being on the wrong side of just about every conflict. People in the Ottoman provinces began to fear the mandate concept since it seemed to suggest European imperial rule, only under another name. That same year, Harry Hall found some weird figurines buried in the desert. These small statues looked like lizards with human bodies. The main site where these unusual artifacts were discovered is called Tel al Aboud. Other figurines were also found in a city called and Urudi. Most of the figurines appeared to be wearing a helmet and have some kind of padding on their shoulders, like the old 1950s science fiction movies. Other artifacts were found that were quickly whisked away to the British Museum. Clay tablets that may have told of something valuable still waiting to be found. I don't know where this cough is coming from. Maybe something in the air. Maybe I'm allergic to cats or kittens. Yikes. Hope not. At the San Remo Conference in April 1920, Britain was awarded the mandate for Mesopotamia, as Iraq was called in the Western world, and a mandate for Palestine. In Iraq, the British administration fired most of the former Ottoman officials, and the new administration had mainly British officials. Many Iraqis began to fear that Iraq would be incorporated into the British Empire. One of the most eminent Shia Mujahideen, Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi al-Shariza, issued a fatwa, a legal opinion or rule based on an Islamic scholar, declaring that service in the British administration was unlawful. There was growing resentment towards new British policies, such as new land ownership laws. This upset tribal leaders, especially when it came to a new tax for burial in the Wadi Us Salam cemetery in Najaf, where Shia from all over the world came to be buried. Can you imagine that? You've got a dead body and you've got to pay a huge tax to the British government to bury it in your own land. Meetings between Shia ulama and tribal leaders discussed strategies for peaceful protests. They also considered violent action if they failed to get any results. They were going to start out like Gandhi and then switch over to something a little more less tactful. The British got busy searching the desert for any usable minerals like oil or relics. We don't know if the British had an inkling of some kind of advanced alien technology before they began their searches, or they stumbled on something they had no idea as to what they had. In one of the many temples, archaeologists found a huge round disc made of stone. What it was turned out to be world changing. How they figured out what they had is also a mystery. One theory says they already knew something about the gateway. Ancient writings told about how the gods would come and go using a huge stone gateway. No one knows where the ancient Sumerians originated from or why they chose to settle where they did. As Zechariah Sitchin said, the Anunnaki visited Earth during the times of ancient Sumerians. They were searching for gold to sustain their home world, and they needed workers to dig for it. If you look at how people go a whole lot crazy when they find gold, this only makes sense if there is some kind of a deep-seated thought in folks' heads that gold is valuable. At a time when man was looking for food, why would he dig up bits of shiny rock and think himself rich? Even today, I see these commercials on TV saying you have to invest in gold. No. You should invest in lead and something to fire it from. A man with a bunch of gold will be at the mercy of a man with a pistol and a bunch of bullets. Anyway, the Anunnaki genetically engineered a slave race, us humans, to dig for gold so they could use it as a fine powder to reflect the sun's rays. This corresponds with the Mesopotamian story involving Enki and Enlil. Human civilization was for a time overseen entirely by alien forces. Human kings were appointed to serve as intermediaries. Eventually, conflicts between the Anunnaki themselves led to a worldwide catastrophe. They called it the Evil Wind, where it was written about in the Lament for It sounds more like a nuclear war. The Sumerians are credited with inventing writing called cuneiform to communicate. Sometime in the early 1800s, scholars discovered they could translate the writing. There were thousands of clay tablets all over the countryside where the Sumerians had lived. There may have been documents telling about the location and the operations of the Stargate. Once the idea of some otherworldly device existed, the folks in charge would want to find out if the story was true and what benefits it might lead to. If you don't have a look, you'll never know. An expedition was launched to go to the location and see what might be there. The official story was the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania were looking for an ancient city called Ur. Ur is about 4,000 to 8,000 years old, but it was lost to time when the Euphrates River changed course and the land dried up. The ruins of the ancient Sumerian city were tracked down about 140 miles southeast of the site of Babylon and about 10 miles west of the present bed of the Euphrates River, in a desolate corner of southern Iraq. Settlements at the site began so long ago that the city's mentioned in the Old Testament. A temple tower known as a ziggurat is about 4,000 years old and maybe older. Inside the temple, the explorers found a huge stone circle, something kind of like a stone donut, buried under the sand. The former inhabitants must have covered the thing with sand in an effort to keep it safe while nobody was around to protect it. The locals became unhappy with the British rule in May of 1920. They began mass meetings and demonstrations in Baghdad. The start of the revolution was centered on peaceful protests against British rule. There were large gatherings at both Sunni and Shia mosques, which showed that cooperation between the two main sects of Iraqi society was possible. At one of the larger meetings, 15 representatives were nominated to present the case for Iraqi independence to the British officials. Acting Civil Commissioner Arnold Wilson dismissed their demands. He said it was impractical. You people are too stupid to run your own country. Let us run it for you. And by the way, here's another tax. One theory is that the people outside the British authorities wanted to get their hands on the Stargate. Not wanting the world to know what was going on, they might have put forth the idea the good citizens of Iraq wanted their independence. They were being guided by unseen elites. An armed revolt broke out in late June 1920. Ayatollah al-Shirazi issued another fatwa which read, "It is the duty of the Iraqis to demand their rights. In demanding them, they should maintain peace and order. But if the English prevent them from obtaining the rights, it is permitted to make use of defensive forces." In other words, start shooting. This seemed to encourage armed revolt. The British authorities tried to counter this by arresting the sheikh of Zawalim tribe. Later, an armed band of loyal tribal warriors stormed the prison and set him free. The revolt soon gained momentum as the British garrison in the mid-Euphrates region were weak and armed tribes much stronger. Somebody was arming these folks. By late July, the armed tribal rebels controlled most of the mid-Euphrates region. The success of the tribes caused the revolt to spread to the lower Euphrates and all around Baghdad. By the end of the revolt, 6,000 to 10,000 Iraqis and about 1,000 British and Indian soldiers were dead. Untold thousands had been injured. The Royal Air Force had dropped 97 tons of bombs, and they had lost 11 aircraft destroyed by the rebels. The revolt caused the British officials to drastically reconsider their strategy in Iraq. The revolt cost the British government £40 million, which was twice the amount of annual budget allotted for Iraq and a huge factor in reconsidering their strategy. The colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, decided a new administration was needed in Iraq, as well as the British colonies in the Middle East. March 1921, at the Cairo Conference, British officials discussed the future of Iraq. The British now wanted to control Iraq through more indirect means, mainly by installing former officials who were friendly to the British government. They eventually decided to install Faisal ibn Hussein as the king. Faisal had worked with the British before World War I, and he had good working relations with certain important officials. As long as they still held the reins, it didn't matter who the figurehead was. The Stargate was now in Iraqi hands, but still controlled by the British. On October 3, 1932, the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq became a fully sovereign state. The British had kind of pulled out. Did they take the Stargate with them? Most records say no. It was either too big or too cumbersome to move. More than likely, the folks running things were never able to get the gate to work. The Iraqi kingdom was now in power with the strings still leading back to Britain. When World War II broke out, German operatives began showing up all over Iraq. They were there to get the people, or at least those in charge, to break free from the British and to form their own government, sort of, under the German thumb. The country was floating in oil. Germany needed oil, but just maybe they were also there looking to get the Stargate up and running. This would have been right in line with the Anunnaki running around the world looking for artifacts. Things like the Spear of Destiny and the Ark of the Covenant. Maybe they wanted a Stargate as well. In May 1941, four German friendly officers launched a coup, chasing away Iraq's British aligned king and installed a hand picked prime minister. The first thing this military junta did was shut off the flow of Iraqi oil from Kirkuk to British refineries in the Mediterranean. Oil critical for the Royal Navy. Oil was even more important to the oil poor German war machine. Four coup plotters, going by the names the Golden Square, had immediately made overtures to Germany upon seizing the government. In part, it was simply because the enemy of their enemy was their ally. The resented British had never stopped ham-fisted meddling in Iraqi politics and maintained two air bases in the country that were used mostly for spying. The Golden Square's invitations also stemmed from the fact that its members had served in the Ottoman military during the First World War. They were well connected and aligned to their old German comrades. The ideals of fascism had made inroads into Iraq. In the country's military, ethno-nationalism and opposition to democracy were rife. Now Hitler was way too close to having a Stargate in his arsenal. What could they do with such a thing? How about sending a few thousand soldiers into the heart of England? Soldiers no one would have been looking for or expecting. The British were watching the coast and their skies, not looking at old relics from the past. Is there a Stargate in England? How about Stonehenge in Wiltshire? There are some folks who believe the huge stone circle might be a portal or a gateway. The ancient site is said to sit over 14 ley lines that converge, and some feel, along with other similar ancient sites, this essentially makes it an energy portal or a Stargate. At least one incident is recorded in recent history that may support this crazy theory. In August 1971, a group of hippies apparently disappeared at Stonehenge while trying to tap into the vibrations of the site. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, without any warning, lightning bolts suddenly struck and a severe storm was unleashed on the area. A policeman who was on duty and in the area recalls seeing blue light coming from the stones. A local farmer also stated he saw these weird lights. Then they heard screams coming from the area. By the time the policeman had made his way to the site, all that remained was a few tent poles from the hippies' tents and the remains of a campfire. The hippies had vanished without a trace, and none of them were ever seen again. Makes you wonder. Had the Nazis been able to travel by way of a Stargate, they would have been 88 miles west of London, and no one would have been expecting them to be there, just simply popping into sight out of nowhere. In 1941, the British Army was stretched really thin. They didn't have enough troops to cover the lines of attack as it was. Now they would have to look into trying to get Iraq back under their control. The head of the military said there was no way he was going to send troops into the desert. Churchill said otherwise. Winston Churchill may have had access to information concerning the Stargate in Ur and how dangerous it would be for the Nazis to have it. He ordered the military to get troops into Iraq no matter what. 1,000 soldiers of the British Army, Indians from Dot Not Feather, were flown into Basra. This was going to have to do. The Golden Square sent about 7,500 troops, guns, and armored cars to the RAF air base 50 miles west of Baghdad. This was intended to encourage the withdrawal of the Indian Army force in Basra. Iraqis declared the base closed to operations until further notice. Any more flights would be considered an act of war. Iraq wasn't at war with Britain at this time. They were simply making money by selling oil to countries willing to buy it. Countries like Germany, who was at war with Britain. May 2nd, not waiting for the Iraqis to declare anything, the RAF launched old, barely usable planes from the Habanaya airfield. They were vastly outnumbered but highly motivated. The surprise attack was just enough to put the Iraqi troops on the defensive, preventing an attack. The British needed to take Baghdad. Even outnumbered and with minimal equipment, they pushed forward. As the invasion forces marched on Baghdad, a Palestinian Arab, his name lost to history, was among a group of soldiers who stumbled onto the telephone switchboard, a nexus of circuits being used by the Iraqi military. No sooner had the young man connected up when a frantic voice came over the line. The voice said, "I've been trying to raise you for 2 hours. What is the matter?" Officers in Baghdad asked for a state of the battle west of the city. The Palestinian adopted his best Iraqi accent, and he reported that there was a column of British tanks, of which there were none, and these tanks were skirting the Euphrates floodwaters and approaching the city. The fiction spread, and soon Iraqi observers on other fronts reported seeing, even engaging with, non-existent British tanks. Subsequent Iraqi and German reports tell of how these fabled tanks were the last straw, sending the Golden Square and its supporters into flight in the last day of May 1941. Mosul had been cut off, so those who managed to escape the country fled by way of Iran. All 4 leaders would be rounded up and executed before the war's end. The last Luftwaffe planes and personnel retreated by way of Syria because they told Berlin of the increasing number of armored cars and tanks rolling into Baghdad, of which there still were none. It's sad that the person who actually turned the battle from a probable loss to a victory is unknown. By spreading the tale of British tanks closing on Baghdad, one man caused the Nazis to retreat and the Golden Square to be captured. As the Nazis were running away, they abandoned and its Stargate. I'll bet Hitler wasn't real happy with his commanders that day. The Hashemites lasted until 1958, running a country using democratic rule. Things should go the direction the people wanted. That is, if democratic process is actually working. If, let's just say, the elections were messed up, then the whole system will be in the hands of a select few. In a dictatorship, everybody knows who's making the rules, and you best keep your head down and do as you're told. This is also the easiest time to get things done. One man says, "I want that Stargate up and running." Who's going to tell him no? You don't have to go through a committee. You don't have to wait for the folks in the Congress to vote yes or no on your ideas. You just say, "Get her done," and they do it. I'm not saying I like that sort of political environment. I'm just saying if you want to get things done, that's the way to do it. Now, the whole world had one. The Tower of Babel, I got a little ahead of myself. The Tower of Babel was built in the plain of Shinar. The Shinar is the Hebrew name for Babylonia. This location of Shinar is first mentioned in Genesis 10 in relationship to Nimrod and the building of his kingdom. If you want a modern day reference, Shinar is located in what we now know as Iraq. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stones and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible. Come, let us go down and confuse their languages, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11:1-9. One story I hear in the lead up to the invasion was Saddam Hussein was also going to rebuild the Tower of Babel. Was there something more to the tower than just a huge structure that could be seen for miles around? Some folks say once Saddam Hussein took power, he wanted the alien technology for his own. Hussein was at the height of his power during the 1980s. At that time, he was propped up by both Moscow and the United States. The CIA were developing close working ties with Hussein's Soviet-trained Mukhabarat, and they wanted to keep Iraq on their good side. The Mukhabarat is the Arabic term for their intelligence, as in CIA-type operations. At the height of his power, Saddam Hussein styled himself as the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. Hussein minted coins with his own profile superimposed on that of the former ruler. He also began rebuilding the ruins of ancient Babylon. Saddam put up a large mural of himself next to Nebuchadnezzar at the entrance to the ruins. He had workers rebuild this 600-room palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and he practiced some of the same tactics used in ancient times. Saddam had his own name inscribed on each and every brick used in the reconstruction. He built his own palace opposite and facing Nebuchadnezzar's palace. His palace was shaped like the Ziggurat. It was built in 4 tiers. On the ceilings and walls of this palace, 360-degree murals depicted scenes from ancient Babylon, and the Tower of Babel. Saddam began renovating the Ziggurat of He succeeded in rebuilding the lowest levels and the entrance staircase, the area where the Stargate was located. The Ziggurat was laid down in about 2000 BC by King Namu as a tribute to the god Sin, and was called Etamenenger, which means a house whose foundation creates terror. Namu's successor, King Shilgi, completed the Ziggurat and then declared himself to be a god. Saddam Hussein echoed the practices of Namu by inscribing his initials throughout monumental buildings. He not only stylized himself as Nebuchadnezzar, who butchered the sons and daughters of Abraham in Jerusalem, but also after Namu and Shulgi and the Babylonian Renaissance of their 3rd dynasty of As the world watched, a madman was taking control of alien technology. This could be bad. If one of my neighbors was building a bomb, I would be worried. If that neighbor just happened to be crazy, I'd be very worried, and I'd either call the police or I'd take steps on my own to see to it that he didn't successfully build a bomb. A Bush Sr. was issued, has, try that again. Bush Sr. had issues with Saddam. 1998, Hussein used border disputes and rows over oil production as an excuse to send troops across the border of neighboring Kuwait. The United Nations Security Council, I'm not going to say anything nasty about that. I'll try to be nice here. Anyway, the Security Council condemned the invasion of a sovereign country. Hussein refused to remove his troops. The U.S. established a coalition of 34 countries to force the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. U.S.-led troops began an aerial raid and then later sent in ground troops to drive back the Iraqis. The Iraqi army, which was made up of poorly trained troops who didn't want to be there in the first place, retreated. And then things got weird. Why did the U.S. stop at the border when they had the Iraqis on the run? American military planners were ready to disarm and dismount the Iraqis and then send them streaming back into Iraq on foot. You close with the enemy and destroy them. You take away their ability to fight. That's how you win a war. That was the kind of image that would humiliate Saddam, and it would make his regime possibly fall apart. But the folks in Washington decided they wanted to look nice. To who, I don't know. And they called for an immediate ceasefire at the worst possible moment. This would have been a good time for some historian who understood what had happened at Dunkirk to step up and say, hey, this is a stupid idea. Had the Nazis taken Dunkirk before the British troops were rescued, the war would have gone in a completely different direction. Had the folks in Washington in 1991 been in charge in 1945, Hitler would have been allowed to regroup and continue fighting even into the 1970s. The folks in Washington said they didn't want to look bad by crushing Saddam and his forces. Instead, they allowed the Iraqi troops to run back home, lick their wounds, and prepare for their next try at an attack. Meanwhile, the Kurds and the Shiites in Iraq had their try at freedom squashed when all the Iraqi troops no longer had somebody bigger to fight with. The military turned all those weapons they were now allowed to hang on to against the folks in their own country. Wait a minute, didn't something like this just take place recently? Those who fail to study history. The only thing that makes any sense is, just as the war was about to be a decisive victory, old George got a phone call. The person or people that pulled his strings told the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world, stop. Stop what you're doing. We still have some uses for Saddam. Never mind by allowing the Iraqi army to escape with all their weapons, they would have to be a second war, where thousands of people would be killed, sacrificed at the altar of the military-industrial complex. That's what we're here for. Live and die so the elites can have a better life. But I'm getting way off the storyline there. The madman was still in power, his army was still mostly intact, and he still had the Stargate. I doubt he ever figured out how to run the thing. It may have been shut down at the other end. The aliens, who I don't trust in the first place, may have simply unplugged the gate at the other end of the wormhole. Did old George allow Saddam to stay in power so he could find out how to operate the Stargate, or where are the folks who really run things waiting for the gate to be used so they could waltz in and take over? If old George was being controlled by forces unseen, perhaps Saddam was in the same position. The puppet masters, who I've talked about before in the past. Saddam got busy violating all of the so called rules he was supposed to behave under, and he continued working on the Ziggurat in Ur. If you try one way of taking over the neighborhood and you fail, then it's a good idea to make a new and different plan and try it again. Along comes young George and a new reason to declare war. I still have to wonder, who is giving the orders to the guys that we think are in charge? A lot of folks will say it's the Illuminati. I don't think so. I just heard Gru inside my head. The Illuminati is way too visible. You can find all kinds of information concerning who started things and who is the current members. No, the folks in charge are people we never hear about. The folks who point us towards other organizations so their manipulation of the world goes unseen and unsuspected. As the invasion of Iraq progressed, so did the disorder. Looting would become rampant, in particular at museums and government buildings containing ancient, priceless relics. Many witnesses, however, would speak of special military units carrying out much of the looting. Even loading entire vaults worth of relics onto heavy trucks, literally thousands of items simply disappeared. Some of these stolen relics would turn up in Europe on the black market. Many, however, seemingly vanished into thin air. To some people, this was a modern example of ancient knowledge being removed from the general population. This in order to maintain control and keep most people ignorant. The elites were done with Saddam. It was time for him to be removed. We are told he was given a fair trial and then hung. There are even videos of him being given a necktie party. Was he really executed, or were we once more being told what we wanted to hear? In the basement of one of Saddam's many palaces in Baghdad, troops found a second Stargate. No one knows what they were looking at, just a huge donut made of stone. A report was filed and everybody moved on, looking for the enemy and any weapons. The folks in the know moved in, and from there, the Stargate vanished. I couldn't find any reference saying this was some ancient structure from centuries ago, or something the boys in the white lab coats had built under Saddam's orders. How would you go about building a Stargate? First, you'd need to find a bunch of ley lines. The more the better. You can find ley lines using dowsing rods. Put a bunch of carved stones into a circle big enough for people to move through. Then see what happens. Imprint them with symbols and ancient writings to make it look like the other Stargates. Once that has been done, all you can do is test it, see if it works. Send a goat through and see if the goat vanishes, or send some troop through that you don't much care for. In the confusion of war, a lot of valuable relics were stolen from museums. A lot of those clay tablets with Sumerian writing on them vanished. 90% of the items stored in a museum are kept in the back room away from the eyes that might be able to understand them. If somebody wanted to get a hold of these tablets and use them to run a Stargate, they would have been able to slip away with anything they wanted while everybody was focused on trying to stay alive. There are Stargates found all over the earth. Some are well-known ancient structures like Stonehenge and the Tiwanaku Bolivian Gate of the Sun. There are other suspected Stargates found in unexpected locations. Sedona, Arizona was once known by the Native Americans as Nawanda, a most sacred city to them. It is said the red rocks of the desert that surround the small town can create vortexes with the capability of transporting people to other realms or dimensions. The local Indians believe these rocks were spiritually charged. People have reported hearing sounds emanating from them in the mountains of Arizona. People say the doorway of the gods is a strange stone arch portal to another time and space. In the 1950s, a local tribesman was aiding treasure hunters who were searching for gold in the mountains. He told them a story of his people dating back to the 1800s. The three tribesmen had discovered the archway while riding in the desert. The story goes that when one of them walked through, he simply disappeared. The other two, believing they had encroached on a sacred location, fled. The tribesman telling the story stated he had also seen a strange incident at the doorway. While out in the desert, a sudden rainstorm hit the area and turned the skies gray with clouds. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of the archway and saw that the sky through the arch were clear and blue. He walked closer to it, seeing that the archway's image of the mountain range was the same. The only difference was, through the archway, there was no storm. He became scared, got on his horse, and got the heck out of there. He told the treasure hunters that only his people knew this story. He had only spoken of it because he had shown that they had shown him kindness and to serve as a warning to not walk through the archway should they manage to locate it. In 2007, while searching for the remains of a shipwreck, scientists discovered a stone structure 40 feet below the surface of Lake Michigan. Thought to be 9,000 years old, the structure has been dubbed Michigan's Stonehenge. The discovery was made by professors of underwater archaeology at Northwest Michigan University, Mark Holley, and his colleagues. One thing of particular interest was a carving on one of the stones of a mastodon, which is believed to have become extinct 10,000 years ago, a possible indication of the structure's age. The location of the site has been kept secret, at least for now. This is part of an agreement with the local Indian tribe who wish to keep the number of visitors to a minimum. They kind of know what happens when too many people show up on their land. Things go missing. While a lot of mainstream scientists are skeptical about the age of this site, and if or even has any relevance, many believe that it is the remains of a stargate or a wormhole. The site has claimed several bizarre disappearances and gained the title the Michigan Triangle. In 1891, a schooner named the Thomas Hume vanished into thin air along with all 7 of its crew while sailing on the lake. In 1921, 11 people were aboard the Rosabelle, which disappeared without a trace. Their boat was found floating listlessly in the water. 1937, while on board the O.M. McFarland as it made its way along Lake Michigan, Captain Donner retired to his quarters to get some much-needed rest after a long shift. 3 hours later, the second mate went to wake his captain. Finding the door locked from the inside and with no response from his captain, he eventually broke down the door. The captain's quarters were empty. The door and all the windows were still locked. How did the captain get out of his quarters? Nobody knows. He'd simply vanished. Could these people have accidentally triggered the Stargate and it sent them on a one-way trip to some unknown distant star system? John Hutchison has theorized the Bermuda Triangle has a portal in it. He thinks ships and planes that vanish are being transported to maybe the other side of the planet, reappearing in the Dragon's Triangle. Some say the triangle is being caused by a portal that was left behind by the Atlanteans. Could there be stargates or portals scattered about our planet? We will never know if we wait for the folks in charge to tell us. Even if somebody comes out with a document signed by Abraham Lincoln himself saying he used a portal to move back and forth while he was president, a very few people would believe it. And come to think of it, I wouldn't believe it. I would be very skeptical of anything like that. However, the only way that us citizens will ever know for sure if there is a portal or not, if the government has a Stargate, is if someday we get to use it. If someday you decide to join the military and they put you in a special unit and they say, "Soldier, we want you to walk through that giant stone donut and see what's on the other side," then you'll know if Stargates actually exist or not. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell folks to listen up. If you didn't enjoy it, well, nobody wants to hear from you anyway. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can contact me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? The same murder three. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.